The talk I'm going to give today is personalising food for consumers and populations. To follow on from the previous talks, I'm going to be taking the perspective from the consumer. So how can understanding information about the consumer drive innovation and sustainability for the red meat industry? So I'm not going to go into too many details around the statistics of the Australian red meat industry. We've heard a lot about that already. But what I will point out is the amount of value adding that the red meat industry undertakes. And so if we compare the amount of value addition to raw commodity in the red meat industry, it's actually quite low. And if we compare that to the dairy, so get this working. So if we have a look at the value of the raw meat, it's about $14 billion. If we look at the dairy industry, the process of the raw commodity, the amount of the raw commodity is about $4 billion. However, dairy goes ahead and goes through a process of transforming or value adding to that product and is able to extract a large amount of profitability through the value addition. So taking the raw milk, turning it into cheese and yogurts, and they're able to value add a significant component in their industries. When you compare this with meat, it's significantly lower. And this provides an excellent opportunity for the red meat industry to identify and to be able to value add to increase profitability. Research that's been completed through the rural industries and also with CSIRO have looked at the megatrends. So what are the future trends that are going to impact not only the agricultural industry, but also the red meat industry? And three of these are key around consumers. Specifically, a hungrier world, a wealthier world, and choosier customers are all focused around megatrends on what is it that the consumer wants and how is the consumer changing. And so this slide breaks down those megatrends for those consumers a little more. And so when we look at the consumer trends globally, and these consumer trends that I'm going to go through are actually amplified much more in and throughout Asia, we see a rapid rise in income. So there's going to be a rapid rise of people moving from poverty up to what we would classify as a middle class. With that rapid rise in income, there's going to be increased buying power, and there's going to be an increased requirement for protein and beef consumption. And there'll also be an overall increase in age as people live longer. So these are the consumer trends, and these consumer trends are actually amplified a lot larger in Asia. And so there is an opportunity here to export products to Asia. So what are the actual consumers wanting and how are they changing? And so that comes under the area of what is called choosy customers. So in the future, customers are going to be more mindful around health and healthy products. They'll be better informed. They'll want better quality food, and they'll also want functional foods. So foods that are just more than the nutritive value that they are composed of. And so there's some excellent opportunities by looking at the consumers and also by looking at export market and value-added products. This is really where there's a fantastic opportunity. So how do we capitalise on that opportunity? An important component in that is, of course, understanding the consumer. So what actually drives consumer food choice? So there's a high variability in the types of foods that people like to consume. And the example that's up there is with Brussels sprouts. So some people like Brussels sprouts, other people don't like Brussels sprouts. I see somebody shaking their head up the back there. They mustn't like Brussels sprouts. So what are the factors that determine what are the factors that determine a consumer's food choice? And there are three main areas. These are intrinsic factors and extrinsic factors. So intrinsically, the genetics of the consumer influences food choice, prior experience, so whether consumer has tried the product before and whether they've had a positive or negative experience with that product, and also the environment. So their health, their diet, their culture, all of these environmental factors come together to also influence food choice. So it's a combination of these three factors that combine together to determine consumer food choice. So if we look a little bit more specifically at the genetics and looking at genetics and consumer food choice, the human genome is made of 6 billion bases. And within those 6 billion bases, there are 4 to 5 individual differences in the genetic code that differ between any two individuals. So between you and the person sitting next to you, you differ by 4 to 5 million different genetic variants. And so these differences account for things like differences in hair colour, our eye colour, our height. They also differ in how we respond, how we perceive foods, our taste, our smell, how we metabolize food. All of these are influenced through the genetic variation that exists between consumers. So along the bottom here, we've got genetic variation. And so genetic variation in the genes that are associated with detection, flavour perception and metabolism, influencing how a consumer perceives or metabolises a food or red meat. And this will then go on to influence food preference and selection. So this slide shows a couple of examples of where genetics has been found to have an influence on consumer food choice. The first one on the left is looking at sweet taste. And so there's a genetic variant in the sweet taste receptor. So this is the receptor in the mouth that influences how we perceive sweetness. And so dependent on whether you have a C variant or a T variant in the sweet taste receptor alters how you perceive sweetness. So here along the bottom we have sugar concentration, so this is increasing sugar concentration of sugar and water solutions, and on the y-axis here we've got sweet intensity. So as the sugar concentration increases, the sweetness intensity increases, but the individuals who have the T variant overall have a lower perception of sweetness compared to individuals with a C variant. And so this represents about 20% of the population, and that population will require more, say, sugar in their tea or coffee to be able to have the same sweetness as individuals who have the C variant. The second example that I've got up there is around boar taint. And so boar taint is a sweaty or urinous off-putting flavour that is in some pork products from uncastrated male boars. And it's controlled by a steroid hormone, whether it's present or not, called androstenone. So there is variability in the perception of androstenone between individuals, and that variability is controlled by an aroma receptor that's located in the nose. And there are a couple of different variants of this aroma receptor that influence both detection and liking of pork products. So these are a couple of examples of how genetics influence consumer food choice. So that's looking at the level of the individual. So comparing genetics between two individuals. What about at a population level? And there's good evidence to suggest that potentially we'll be able to tailor foods specifically to different ethnicities or different groups of people. So 25% of the genetic variation in an Asian population is actually specific to that Asian population. And it's not found in European or African or other populations. When we look at specifically at aroma genes, we see a large variability between different populations in terms of the genetic variability that's there. So this figure here shows the variability in the aroma genes that are associated with perception of flavour. And what it shows is that the between population diversity is higher than the within population. So if we look at the Asian population here, which is these three populations here, we see a red colour with against the African and the yellow in the European and Americas. So this is signifying higher genetic variability between the population. But when we look within the Asian population, we see that it sits much lower in the scale, showing that there is greater diversity between different populations than there is within a population. And so this provides an opportunity to design foods that are specific to a population, that are specifically tailored to, say, a European or an Asian palate. So what about red meat and what is known in terms of consumer genetics and red meat consumption? So twin studies show that there's a significant genetic component with both meat consumption and also red meat liking. And when we look at, say, red meat liking, so this is from a recent publication in a large number of twins, it was found that the genetic contribution to red meat liking was very high. So this is 49% of the variability between individuals in their liking for red meat was able to be explained through genetics. This 49% is very comparable to the genetic variability that we see with vegetables. So we know that there are specific genetic variants that influence vegetables. We don't know so much about red meat, but it's nice to see that the genetic contribution is quite similar between meat and vegetables. When we look specifically at different types of meat, we see beef and lamb both having a large genetic contribution, where chicken is much lower. And so it's likely that there are genetic variants, say in sensory perception genes, in metabolism and genes associated with health, that will be impacting on consumer meat preferences. So now I'm going to move on to the environment. So I showed in the slide earlier that there's a high variability in the foods that we like to consume, and there were three different components to that. So there were intrinsic and extrinsic factors. Some of the examples of environmental factors that influence consumer food choice include culture, prior exposure, health, and chronic disease. And I've got an example there on the right, which looks at the perception of fat between lean and obese individuals. So we've got fat emulsions that were tested in both lean and obese groups for their ability to detect a fatty acid of increasing concentration. What we see is that the lean individuals have a reduced ability, are able to detect the fat at a lower concentration. They have an increased perception of fat compared to the obese group. And this is a nice example highlighting the influence of the environment on influencing sensory perception. So what happens when we look at some of these factors together? So for example, gene and environment, and we start asking some of the important questions. Can consumer food choices be changed? And if genetics contributes to consumer food choices, is this actually modifiable? And so the current thinking around this is that potentially, yes, it is, and it's dependent on a number of factors. So genetics is an intrinsic component to all of us and will provide a benchmark. And then on top of that, we have a range of extrinsic factors, and dependent on the strength of those extrinsic factors, they will influence the overall, say, consumer response to a liking or consumption of a product. So what we really need to do is to be able to measure the genetic and extrinsic weights, and we could then start modelling what is the individual components that are driving consumer response. And so we have the ability to catalogue the range of genetic variants that are within an individual and between individuals to start teasing out some of those associations. And so that's really the idea behind a project that we're currently in discussion with AMPC to try and untangle and understand the plasticity of consumer response to red meat. And really the idea of what we're wanting to look at in the first instance is to start untangling what is the genetic and environmental determinants of red meat preference and consumption. And to do this, we propose to look at multiple populations, both in Australia and overseas. So within Australia, we would be looking at a European population, a Chinese population in Australia, and a Japanese population in Australia. We'd also look at populations overseas, so a Chinese population in China and a Japanese population in Japan. Because we're looking at the different populations both internally within the country where they originate, and then also in a different environment, will have the power to start untangling that important question around how much is genetic, how much is environmental, and how much can we actually shift or change consumer food choice. And so thank you. So this will have, so the findings from this type of research will have an impact across the supply chain, and dependent on the results, there are many opportunities that could come from this. These could include targeting products to specific populations. So if we know that there are specific genetic variants and we cannot change consumer response around those variants, we can actually know which products we should deliver to those specific populations. There's potential to identify premium meat that has an enhanced flavour to certain populations, which may come from a lower grade or style of meat. And there's also the possibility to value add for health. So I'm going to leave it there, and thank you very much.